All right, let's talk about the advantages and disadvantages of solar energy. So when it comes to solar power comes in a series of variations, but these are examples of photovoltaic cells. These are panels that absorb the sun's energy and converts it into electricity, and that's a common way that we use solar power. This little diagram down here, this picture shows where that is most beneficial for people. So you see in the Southwest, where all those areas are dark, is where the best place for solar energy exists. In Wyoming, you have patches, and we're medium range here. If you go back east up in this area, not the best. It's not as good, let's put it that way. But the technologies are improving constantly. So first of all, when we talk about passive solar energy is not intentionally grabbing it with a device. So we're not using photovoltaic cells. Instead, we're just using natural situations to maximize it. So if you look at these houses down here, these houses are designed to maximize passive solar heating. So you see they have long roof lines, they have windows, they have eaves. So this diagram over here shows that during the winter time, the sun's lower in the sky, and the angle that the sunlight comes in is a bit more of a flat angle. That allows the sun to come into the house in the winter, get absorbed into the materials in the house, usually rocks, concrete, things like that, and then warm the inside of the house. During the summertime, when the sun's higher in the sky, there's an eave or an overhang that blocks that sun and doesn't let it come in the house. So it's heating the house during the winter, it's not heating it during the summer. That would be an example of passive heating, not using devices to do it, but just the natural setup of things. By contrast, we have what we call active solar heating systems, and these are when we use devices. So photovoltaics, which I showed you earlier, these are hot water heaters right here. So these are all tubes that have water flowing through them. As the water flows through them, the sun heats it up, and then that works its way inside. And so you can use this you use a heat exchanger and a pump, and you pump that water through there, and then you capture that heat and then go out and use to heat your house in a broiler, heat hot water up. I know somebody that had this in their pool house, and they used it exclusively to heat their indoor swimming pool, for instance. So this is another way to gather energy. So advantages and disadvantages both. Advantages, it's free to use active and passive solar. Once it's all set up, it's free. The net energy is moderate to high, which means the net energy gain in passive, you don't have to do anything and you get free energy. So that is a high net. In the active one, it's still pretty good energy exchange. You're not getting as much bang for your buck as you do from fossil fuels, but it's still pretty good. It's pretty easy to install. There's no CO2 emissions. There's no real pollution out of it. You don't mess with the land very much. The cost can be a little bit troublesome. When building buildings a certain way, it costs a little more. When adding photovoltaics, it costs a little more. So those are some issues, but not extremely high. You need access to sun quite often, which is tricky in some locations. The sun can be blocked by things outside of the house, like trees and mountains and things like that. The environmental costs aren't figured into the system. How much environmental cost is there in building the photovoltaics, for instance? Not figured in. You need a heat storage system of some kind in your house now, so you have to add that expense in. That initial cost is very high to put in photovoltaics and stuff like that. Then you have to maintain and repair the system, and then you have to have the collectors and stuff, the panels and stuff might not be pretty to look at. Those are all drawbacks. And so, moving on with this idea and extending it on a little bit, we have bigger systems that use solar panel. This is called a solar thermal system. This is a huge central tower right here, and these are all mirrors. The sun hits the mirrors and bounces it at that tower. And that tower is where they have like a special oil that they have in there that heats up. Think of it like a magnifying glass. All that sun is hitting that one spot and heating it up. And that hot temperature then can turn a turbine and generate electricity. And so these are usually put up in like really sunny deserty areas. The problem is they have a really high cost and their energy yield isn't really high in comparison to that. And so they're not they are a way to collect free energy, but the cost of setting it up and the amount of energy you get out versus the money you spend isn't great. There are some solutions in areas, especially poor countries, where there's not a lot of wood for cooking. They're starting to see more and more of these solar ovens, solar cookers. So people do all of their cooking outside in this pot because they have access to sun, but maybe not to the wood. So it can be a solution in places where there's not a lot of money or access to infrastructure for other means. We use it to produce electricity. I talked about photovoltaic cells a little bit. In a nutshell, what happens is the sun gets absorbed in here, it releases free electrons, and you basically convert solar energy into electrical energy. And the cool thing about these are they're really altering how they do things with photovoltaics. They're becoming much more efficient at gaining energy, and they're changing the way they're being done. For instance, these are solar shingles. They're shingles on a house, and you're looking at them from a certain perspective here. But you put them up on kind of like individual shingles. They blend into the individual shingles on your house, yet they're collecting energy. So they're coming up with a lot better ways to make them more aesthetically pleasing. And these solar cells can be used in rural areas. Again, in poor countries where they don't have access to infrastructure, setting these up can be a wonderful way for them to gain energy. For pumping water is what they're mainly used for now. But ample sunlight, rural areas, great option. So can we produce enough electricity this way? Well, that's a tough one to call. So solar power, first of all, has the largest potential for electricity on the planet, because there's so much sun hitting our Earth. But the reality is less than 1% of the world's electricity comes from it. Some countries are better than others at it. Germany dominates the solar generation world, then Italy, China. US is right there hanging out, and then you can go down further and further and further with other countries. But we're nowhere near hitting the capacity of what we're capable of. You see that the amount of photovoltaic energy in the United States has grown. Worldwide, it has grown. It's being used more and more, but it still isn't close to what its potential is. Here are the drawbacks, advantages, and disadvantages of using these solar panels. A fairly high energy net yield once they're set up and installed. They can still work on cloudy days, not always the great, but they're very quick and easy to install for most people. You can easily add on to them if you need to. They don't make CO2 emissions. They don't have a huge environmental impact. They can last 20 to 40 years once they're set up, which is nice. You can reduce the use of fossil fuels and land usage for like mining and things like that. Problems with it: if you don't have access to sun, it's a problem. It's not the most efficient system in the world. You need a place to store, so you need batteries and things like that. Environmental impacts aren't figured in, of course. That's always an answer. It's a high cost initially in the short term, but in the long term it's not. And then you have to convert the DC current into AC current, which you got to have a converter. That's the most expensive part of the whole system. And you have to use a lot of land if you build them in grids like this. If you're not using rooftops or land that's already been utilized. That's it for now. Moving on.